Hi everyone, and welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker. I'm building on last week's presentation of talking about shape and how it relates to our motif of the interior. Last week I talked a bit about isolating a few large shapes and starting to compose. Today I'm going to develop that a bit further and show you how you can think about the paper size, the paper shape, as an important part of that process, and how the artist starts to build their painting around a center of interest or a focal point. So come on with me back to the Pavement Cafe. Let's do a painting together of this nice interior. Well, this is a shot of the interior that I plan to use for my motif today, and I'm going to show you a few versions. One is a vertical. This is a sketch that I made of that motif, putting the subject high in the painting, and have a look where the center of interest is. Different distance from each side, high in the painting, creates an interesting dynamic, don't you think? This is the finished painting that I did that I would like to show you on Instagram at some point. And I wasn't satisfied with just one rendering. I decided to, in fact, pursue this as a more of a landscape mode, and so I brought the center of interest a little lower to the painting, made the tables a little larger, put a few more things on the table, and my focal point is a little right and low in the painting. So this is to maybe demonstrate that there's multiple ways of looking at your subject. One of the things that I found very important was to offset the center. In other words, avoid the center of the paper as your center of interest. The reason this is important is because when we place it in the center of the paper, in the middle of the paper, we automatically create balance. And balance is important to painting. In fact, composition is a matter of balancing and arranging, but to start from a point of balance can be detrimental to the painting, or it creates an energy or an absence of energy, actually, that makes the painting feel boring, to put it bluntly. So when we think about placing our subject and placing it in an interesting part of the paper, we try to offset it. In other words, well, a good formula is actually to think of the center of the piece being a different distance from each side of the paper. What you see me doing with these light washes is creating a feeling of light coming in from that back window, and just a sense of the cool shadows or some of the figures that will be rising up from the bottom of the page. If you notice, it's basically a warm against a cool hue, and this is sort of a foundation to help me to isolate my main figure, which is going to be rising against that yellow area. Isolate that figure, and later on to sort of counter that figure with other figures. So this first step of creating a feeling of luminosity and sort of this almost the shape of a cross through the center and up and down is very helpful in creating the sort of composition that I want in this piece. My center of interest is slightly low and slightly right. I can see it in the drawing. Now the background washes are evolving to support that. And at this stage I can be very free, very light with the brush, knowing that I'm going to return with some strong darks and capitalize on that passage of light behind. So after applying the initial wash, which is very, very light hues, yellows and blues, I start with a mid-tone, and that's to isolate the main shapes. I've added some water in places so that I can get sort of a soft transition in the background. So even though I'm using a dark hue, a dark color, if I maintain a soft edge back there, it will be rather passive, and I can save my strong edges, my hard edges, for where I want to have a focal point. And I use this mid-tone to isolate the primary shapes, the basic shapes of the window, which is a large shape, some of the repeating shapes of the hanging paintings on the wall or tabletops. These will be left rather bright through the context of the painting. And my dark shapes, I use that as well to establish some important dark shapes of figures and reflections across the tabletops and above the tabletops. In this particular painting, I'm using a pretty strong mid-tone made up of ultramarine blue, a bit of burnt sienna, and neutral tint. And I'm quite aware of the paint consistency, how thick that paint is on my brush, and using not only contrast but a hard edge to really create my focal point, which are the figures that you see rising against the window, that sort of centralized figure. And everything else is kind of balanced against that. So when I'm adding darks elsewhere, I'm considering how they balance against my main subject. I don't mind if there's some similarity with the dark shapes that are on the periphery, or if my eye gets pulled a little left or right, but the value of kind of establishing a center of interest is that you can return to that spot after your eye is wandering around, or the eye of your audience wanders around and observes other parts of the painting. It returns to your center of interest. And this center of interest really explains what's going on in the painting more than any other place. So it's very practical to think about that and almost start with that idea when you're conceiving a composition or a story, or really deciding on what it is you want to paint. And in some of my classes, I'll go as far as to suggest to the students that they title their painting first, just so that we know going forward what it is we want to say in our painting, and we're not just sort of replicating what we see, every detail, every part of the scene that's in front of us. We want to have some working thought or some motivation to paint this scene. It could be a beautiful color combination. It could be a beautiful shapes. In many cases, for me, it's how the light moves through the scene and affects the subject. It can be a story, this painting in particular, or some of this cafe series does carry a sort of story element or literary element of figures interacting, doing something that tells a story, but quite often it's more visually oriented. And so I use this to kind of anchor my scene. I use the center of interest, and it also helps keep me out of trouble. For instance, if we look again at our source image, and we are to paint it with reference to what's going on behind the scene, beyond the window, where you see a few colors and lights and darks that we see across the street. This would diminish the value of the figures that are rising against that light. And so these sorts of choices are guided by, how can we keep clarity in this center of interest, and at the same time we would like to have some subtlety, but it's kind of push and pull. So everything I do is kind of measured against this center of interest, and if something is taking away from that or distracting the movement, the eye movement through the painting. Then I'll subdue it or even eliminate it, or maybe do something else. But I find that this idea is very, very practical and really helps to focus every decision that I make in the painting. Well, this application of darks is really starting to concentrate the light and allow me to start to see the finish of the painting as I would like it to be. And from this point, I'll be refining the image somewhat with a smaller brush, adding some brighter colors here and there to give accents, adding some highlights, and so on. It's a particular view that I like, looking out towards the street and the figures against the light. I feel that really captures the spirit of this interior. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarities between this and last week's painting. We have paintings on the walls, though they're in a slightly different position. There's figures enjoying a beverage or a conversation. Some of the characters are quite modern in that they're using a cell phone or perhaps a laptop, but still the scene has sort of a, I would say, sort of a nostalgic feel. Here I'm just rubbing in a bit of color to create a feeling of freshness in the paintings above. Maybe make that yellow and blue come out a little more, and bring just a little splash of color to the subject. I'll build on that, especially through my focal area, so that I get a little more attention, a little more interest in that area. Well, kind of winding down here and putting on some last touches with the brush. I want to get a few colors towards the center. Here you can see the painting is practically finished. What I want to do with a little confidence is put in a few highlights on the shoulders of this seated figure, color to the bottle, overhead lamp, just a couple things to round out the atmosphere. And then I feel that this painting is pretty much captured the scene as I wanted to portray it. A sunlit scene with a kind of busy activity, people enjoying a quiet moment. There's a little more energy in this scene perhaps than in the previous scene. But that's the nature of this sort of place, isn't it? It can be quiet at one moment and it can be overflowing at the next. And yeah, here you see it kind of, as it dries, those darks tend to stiffen up a little bit and get deeper. And I'm very happy with the raking light. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I'm glad you could visit me in my studio today, where we're talking about developing an interior, thinking about a center of interest, thinking about shape. We're going to continue to explore this in the upcoming weeks. Spend a little time to look in the description below, where you'll see a list of the materials I'm using, as well as a link to a PDF file that I think helps to explain these ideas with a little more clarity. Then I'll see you next week when we visit another cafe.